23 men loaded into 2 modified Black Hawk helicopters in Jalalabad, Afghanistan in 2011, about to execute the most consequential 40 minutes in modern military history. Operation Neptune Spear, planned under Admiral William McRaven at Joint Special Operations Command, carried a failure rate that analysts quietly pegged at 50%. The compound in Abbottabad might have been empty, the helicopters might have been detected, and Pakistan's military might have scrambled jets. And yet, when one of those Black Hawks crashed straight into the compound wall, a scenario that would have unraveled most operations, the team adjusted in seconds, not minutes. Nobody panicked. Nobody radioed McRaven for new orders. They flowed into a contingency they had already rehearsed, cleared every room, confirmed the target, and extracted in under 38 minutes. That was not luck, and it was not superhuman composure. That was planning, but not the kind of planning you have ever been taught. Most people get the same thing wrong about Navy SEALs. They assume the advantage is physical, that it comes down to toughness and grit, and the ability to suffer longer than the other guy. BUD, S, basic underwater demolition SEAL training, absolutely filters for that. The cold water torture at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, the Log PT, Hell Week, all of it is real. But operators who have been through it keep saying the same thing. The physical piece is the entry fee. The actual edge, the reason SEAL teams accomplish what conventional forces cannot, lives in how they plan. And if you have ever watched a product launch collapse, a software migration spiral, or a startup burn through its runway building the wrong thing, you have already seen exactly what happens when that planning method is absent. The failure mode is identical, only the terrain is different. The SEAL planning methodology carries a formal name. It is called the SEAL planning cycle, and its backbone is a process the broader special operations community adapted from the military decision-making process, or MDMP, the 7-step framework used across the US Army. The SEAL version is not the bureaucratic Army version, though. It runs faster, carries more paranoia, and it is built around a single assumption that changes everything, which is that the plan will fail. Where conventional Army units often get bogged down in the full deliberate MDMP process, sometimes taking 12 to 24 hours to produce a complete order, SEAL teams compress the same logic into something that can execute in hours, or even less, without sacrificing rigor. That compression alone is a lesson most project teams have never learned. The details matter here, so let me walk you through how it actually works. Every SEAL operation begins not with a plan, but with something called a warning order. This is the moment the team first learns a mission exists. What is critical to understand is that the warning order contains almost no detail, and that is deliberate. It tells the team the broad objective, the timeline, and the constraints, and nothing else. The reason is counterintuitive. Too much information too early locks people into a single mental model. What the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide calls progressive elaboration, the idea that planning should deepen gradually rather than arrive fully formed, is something SEALs operationalized decades before it became a textbook concept. The warning order activates parallel processing, so different operators start thinking about their own piece, whether that is comms, logistics, medical, or fire support, before anyone has drawn a single diagram. From there, the team moves into mission analysis, and this is where things diverge from how most project teams work. The primary question in mission analysis is not what is the plan, it is what are we actually being asked to accomplish and what will stop us. SEALs separate the stated mission from the implied tasks. The stated mission might be to secure a compound, but the implied tasks include everything unstated yet necessary, things like establishing a perimeter, managing detainees, coordinating air support timing, and handling civilian presence. Most project teams skip this step entirely and take the brief at face value before they start executing. SEALs treat the brief as the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. Then comes course of action development, which is where you would expect a team to pick one plan and run with it. SEALs do not do that. They develop multiple courses of action, usually 3, and stress test each one against specific criteria like speed, surprise, security, simplicity, and the most overlooked criterion of all: what happens when it breaks? Each course of action gets a branching decision tree, not a single contingency. If the breach fails, they do one thing. If the helicopter cannot land at the primary landing zone, they shift to another. And if they lose comms, a default action kicks in automatically. They call these contingency triggers, and they are all pre-decided. The team does not improvise in the moment because they are executing a decision that was already made in a calm room with good lighting and coffee. In engineering, this is what trade study analysis is supposed to accomplish, evaluating multiple solutions against weighted criteria before committing any resources, but almost nobody does it. Teams fall in love with the first workable idea and sprint toward it, which is what SEALs would call a catastrophic single point of failure. After selecting a course of action through what they call a COA brief, a formal decision point where leadership picks the path, the team builds the full operations order, the OPORD. It always follows 5 paragraphs: situation, mission, execution, sustainment, and command and signal. That structure is a compression format, a way to take enormous complexity and force it into something that every operator can hold in their head. And then they rehearse, not once, and not as a table read, but as full dress rehearsals at a site that replicates the target as closely as possible. During the Abbottabad raid, McRaven's team built a full-scale replica of the compound at a classified facility in North Carolina and ran the operation repeatedly until the sequence became automatic. SpaceX does something structurally identical with what Elon Musk's team calls test to failure. They do not simulate launches, they launch, watch things break, and iterate. Both cultures share the same assumption, which is that rehearsal is not practice for success, but practice for failure. The difference is that SEALs do it with people in the loop, not just hardware. Now here is where it gets interesting, because the SEAL planning cycle is not just a military process. It is the exact same structural logic that separates projects that deliver from projects that collapse. And the reason most project management frameworks fail is not that they are bad frameworks. It is that they skip the steps SEALs consider non-negotiable. In SEAL operations, you have a warning order, and in project management, that maps to your project charter, which most teams either skip entirely or load with so much detail that it becomes the plan itself, killing parallel thinking before it starts. In SEAL Ops, you have mission analysis that separates stated objectives from implied tasks, and in business that is requirements decomposition. The number one reason projects fail, according to the Project Management Institute's Pulse of the Profession report, is poor requirements gathering, not budget, not talent, not technology. SEALs figured this out decades ago. In SEAL planning, you stress test multiple courses of action before committing. And in business, that is trade study analysis, which almost nobody does. And in SEAL culture, you rehearse until failure feels familiar, while in tech, most teams ship the first version they can get to compile and call it done. The mechanism is identical, only the materials are different. What most people do not realize is that when a project fails, the failure almost never originates in execution. It originates in planning, specifically in the steps that were never taken. The SEAL framework exposes exactly which steps those are. The first principle SEALs operate on is what they call commander's intent. Every operation carries a 2-sentence statement of intent that captures the purpose and desired end state, stripped of all tactical detail. This concept was formalized across special operations after failures in Mogadishu in 1993, the Black Hawk Down incident, which revealed that when communication breaks down, operators without a clear understanding of intent make catastrophic independent decisions. General Stanley McChrystal, who later commanded JSOC and wrote about it in his book Team of Teams, described this as the shift from chessmaster leadership, where one leader directs every move, to gardener leadership, where the leader creates conditions for independent, good decisions. Commander's intent is the seed of that garden. Jocko Willink, the former SEAL Task Unit commander in Ramadi, who brought special operations thinking to the business world through extreme ownership, calls it decentralized command. The terminology differs from one operator to the next, but the architecture stays the same. Give every person on the team a decision-making filter they can apply without comms, without leadership, and without a plan. In project management, this maps directly onto what good product leaders call a North Star metric or a project vision statement. But here is the gap that most teams fall into. Most project vision statements end up either too vague to be useful or too detailed to be memorable. Something like, deliver a best-in-class customer experience, is not commander's intent, it is a poster. Real commander's intent would sound more like this. Reduce time to first value below 4 minutes so that trial users convert before they lose attention. That statement is specific enough to guide every decision a designer, engineer, or marketer makes, even when they cannot reach the project lead. Amazon's leadership reportedly used this kind of forcing function during the development of AWS, where the intent was clear: make infrastructure a utility. Every ambiguous decision got filtered through that lens. When teams debated features, the question was never whether something was technically impressive, the question was whether it made infrastructure more like electricity. And this principle is not limited to tech or the military. Emergency medicine runs on the same logic. The SBAR protocol, which stands for Situation, Background, Assessment, and Recommendation, gives every nurse and paramedic a decision framework that works without waiting for the attending physician. When a patient is crashing at 3 in the morning and the doctor is 8 minutes away, SBAR keeps the team aligned. It is commander's intent with a stethoscope. So here is your first shift. Before your next project kicks off, write 2 sentences that capture the purpose and the end state, and then test it. If a team member has to make a decision at 2 in the morning without you, does your intent statement give them enough to choose correctly? And if not, rewrite it until it does. But that is not even the most important principle. The second SEAL concept that project teams almost universally skip is what operators call the red cell. In SEAL mission planning, a subset of the team gets formally assigned to attack the plan, and the distinction between attacking and critiquing matters. The red cell's job is to think like the adversary, find every vulnerability, and present them in a structured brief. This is not brainstorming, it is adversarial analysis with a mandate. The concept was refined at the Naval Warfare Development Command in Norfolk and became standard after operations in the early 2000s revealed that groupthink, meaning teams falling in love with their own plans, was causing avoidable mission failures. In the business world, this maps onto the pre-mortem technique that psychologist Gary Klein formalized in his research on naturalistic decision-making in the late 1980s. The study of how experts actually make choices under pressure rather than how models say they should. A pre-mortem asks the team to imagine the project has already failed and then work backward to identify causes, which is powerful on its own. But here is why the SEAL version works better. A pre-mortem is a thought exercise, while a red cell is a role. It gets assigned, it carries authority, and the red cell presents their findings to leadership as a formal gate, meaning the plan cannot proceed until the vulnerabilities have been addressed or accepted with open eyes. Basecamp, the project management software company, inadvertently applied this when Jason Fried and David Heinemeier Hansen implemented what they call a betting table process, detailed in their shape-up methodology. Before any project gets resources, a small group's explicit job is to interrogate the pitch, identify risks, and decide whether the bet is worth making. Projects that cannot survive that scrutiny never get built. The result is that Basecamp ships consistently with a team of roughly 50 people, while competitors with 10 times the headcount struggle to deliver. Your second shift is this: assign someone the explicit role of plan, attacker, not devil's advocate as a personality trait, but a formal role with a deliverable. Their job is to present the 3 most likely failure modes before work begins. If your plan cannot survive a 20-minute attack from a smart colleague, it will not survive contact with reality. That covers Principle 2, and the third one is where most teams completely fall apart. SEALs call it actions on contact, and it is the planning discipline that addresses the moment when the operation meets reality and the plan stops working, because it will stop working. Mike Tyson said it more directly than any general ever has. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. But what Tyson did not say, and what SEALs understand, is that the solution is not to stop planning, it is to plan for the punch. Air Force Colonel John Boyd formalized the underlying logic in what he called the OODA loop, which stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act, a decision cycle originally designed for fighter pilots in aerial combat. Boyd's insight was that the side that cycles through decisions faster wins, and the way you cycle faster is by preloading as many decisions as possible before the fight starts. Actions on contact are pre-decided responses to specific triggers. If the team takes fire from the north side during approach, they execute a pre-rehearsed flanking maneuver. If the primary entrance is blocked, they default to a secondary breach point. And every one of these decisions gets made before stress and adrenaline and fog remove the team's ability to think clearly. Organizations like DARPA and the Naval Health Research Center in San Diego have invested heavily in the research behind this, because under extreme stress, the prefrontal cortex shuts down. Daniel Kahneman described the broader mechanism in thinking, fast and slow, where what he calls System 2, your deliberate analytical mind, gets overwhelmed, and System 1, the fast instinctive pattern-matching layer, takes over. If you have not preloaded the pattern, you freeze or default to something that does not work. SEALs preload the pattern, and that is exactly what actions on contact is. It is System 2 thinking done in advance, so that System 1 can execute it under fire. In project management, this translates to contingency planning, but almost nobody does it at the level of granularity that actually helps. Most project risk registers are filled with vague risks, like timeline slippage, matched with vague mitigations, like add resources. That is not a contingency plan, that is a wish. A SEAL-grade contingency plan looks like this. If the API integration misses the June 15 deadline, we ship with the manual workaround documented in Appendix C, notify enterprise clients by June 10, and delay the automated version to Sprint 14. That gives you a trigger, a pre-decided action, and a communication protocol, with no ambiguity and no meeting required. Spotify's squad model, which has been studied and replicated across the tech industry, embeds something close to this approach. Squads operate with enough autonomy that when a dependency fails or a priority shifts, they already have pre-agreed fallback behaviors. They do not escalate and wait. They execute the contingency. Henrik Nyberg, who documented Spotify's engineering culture, noted that the model works not because of the autonomy itself, but because of the alignment that precedes it, which is structurally commander's intent combined with actions on contact. And here is the contrarian point that might bother some people. This is exactly why most Agile and Scrum implementations fail. The Agile Manifesto famously values responding to change over following a plan, and SEALs would agree with the spirit of that statement, but reject how most teams practice it. Most Agile teams interpret that principle as permission to skip front-end planning entirely, meaning no commander's intent, no red cell, and no pre-decided contingencies, and then they call it agility when they scramble to react to problems they could have anticipated. Real agility is not the absence of planning. It is planning so thoroughly that adaptation becomes automatic. Your third shift is straightforward. For every critical milestone in your project, define one specific trigger and one specific pre-decided response. Not "we will figure it out" and not "we will have a meeting." A trigger and a response, decided now, while your System 2 is still online. The fourth principle ties everything together, and it is the one SEALs consider the most sacred, which is the debrief. Every SEAL operation ends with an after-action review, a structured debrief where rank disappears and every team member, from the newest operator to the team leader, reviews what happened against what was planned. The Naval Special Warfare community has turned this process into something almost ritualistic. It happens immediately while memory is fresh, and it follows a rigid format: what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, why the gap exists, and what changes for next time. McChrystal scaled this practice across thousands of operators and intelligence analysts during his command of JSOC, conducting daily operations and intelligence briefs, where the debrief culture became the heartbeat of the entire organization. This is not a retrospective in the agile sense, where teams gather every 2 weeks and sort observations onto colored sticky notes. SEAL debriefs are surgical, and they focus on decision points. Where did the team decide correctly? Where did they decide wrong? And what information were they missing? The culture of the debrief is what allows the SEAL planning process to improve with each iteration, and that is why teams that have operated together for years plan with a quality that looks almost psychic from the outside. It is not intuition, it is compressed pattern recognition built through hundreds of honest debriefs. Ed Catmull, co-founder of Pixar, built a parallel structure he called the Brain Trust. After every screening of a film in development, a group of senior creatives gives candid, rank-free feedback where the director has to listen but does not have to comply, just like a SEAL team leader who hears the debrief but retains command authority. The Brain Trust is credited with rescuing films like Toy Story 2 and turning Pixar into what is arguably the most consistently successful creative studio in history. Catmull wrote explicitly in Creativity Incorporated that the process works because of the cultural commitment to honesty over comfort, which is the exact same value that makes SEAL debriefs effective. But the most dramatic proof of this principle comes from neither Hollywood nor the military. It comes from aviation. The 1977 Tenerife airport disaster killed 583 people when 2 Boeing 747s collided on a runway in the Canary Islands. And the investigation revealed that the catastrophe came not from mechanical failure but from communication breakdown, specifically a co-pilot who did not challenge his captain's fatal decision. The aviation industry responded by building crew resource management, a structured debrief and communication system that strips rank from the cockpit and requires every crew member to voice concerns. Since its implementation, pilot error accidents have dropped dramatically. Crew resource management follows the same architecture as the SEAL after-action review. Remove hierarchy, focus on decisions, change behavior. 3 different industries, military, film, and aviation, arrived at the same structural solution independently, and that convergence is how you know the principle is real. Your 4th shift works like this. After your next project milestone, run a debrief with one rule, which is no rank. Ask 3 questions. What did we plan to happen? What actually happened? And what do we change? Then actually change it, because the debrief that does not produce a change is just a meeting. So what Navy SEALs figured out through decades of life and death operations, and what project managers and startup founders and product teams are still paying to learn the hard way, is a unified principle that sounds simple but proves brutally hard to practice. Planning is not about predicting the future. Planning is about preloading decisions so that when the future surprises you, you already know what to do. Commander's intent, the red cell, actions on contact, and the after-action review are not separate ideas. They are all expressions of the same truth. The teams that win are not the ones with the best plan. They are the ones who thought the hardest about what happens when the plan fails. Eisenhower captured it decades before the SEALs formalized any of this. Plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. That distinction sounds like wordplay until you have lived through a project collapse that a single pre-mortem would have prevented. Next time you kick off a project, any project, whether it is a product launch, a migration, a rebrand, or a funding round, ask yourself this question borrowed from a SEAL mission brief. What does my team do when they cannot reach me and the situation has changed? If you do not have an answer, then you do not have a plan. You have a guess wrapped in a Gantt chart, and guesses, as every SEAL operator learns on their first deployment, get people hurt. The best projects are not built with better tools or bigger budgets or more agile certifications. They are built with better pre-decisions, and you just did not have the vocabulary for it until now. Navy SEALs and project management are two worlds that seem completely unrelated, but the underlying principles connect at every level. Stress degrades decision-making, complexity hides implied requirements, and teams default to the level of their preparation rather than the level of their ambition. Emergency rooms, cockpits, animation studios, and special operations compounds all converge on the same structural truth. That is what this is about, finding the hidden structures that connect unrelated fields so you can borrow what works from the people who have pressure-tested it with the highest stakes imaginable. If you want to see how fighter pilot debriefing culture explains why your team's retrospectives do not work, and how John Boyd's OODA loop rewrites everything you think you know about sprint planning, subscribe, because that is next. And drop a comment with the most spectacular project failure you have ever seen that a 20-minute pre-mortem would have prevented. I want to hear the war stories.